Most people who try to learn a language fail miserably, and that's probably going to be you as well, at least if you try to study your way to fluency. Now, I personally found this out the hard way by learning more and more things about the language, but never actually getting over that hump of being able to actually hold conversations and understand natural speech. Instead, I was stuck trying to translate in my head and producing unnatural speech when I actually spoke. But soon after I found out about and started using the things I'm going to cover in this video, I noticed my comprehension skyrocket, and using the language finally felt natural. Now, I think the reason most people never make any real progress is because of the dangerous myth of language learning for achieving fluency. This myth was exactly the thing keeping me stuck, wondering why I wasn't making any progress. So, unless you want that to be you as well, then you should probably listen up. Now, the first thing you need to understand about language learning is that most people will claim their method is the most effective one, but the reality is that there's usually only one single thing really moving the needle. Now, this is something you'll see in pretty much every field where there's money to be made, and language learning is no different. Claiming that this one app is what's going to get you to fluency is no different than claiming that one diet is the only one that can help you lose weight. The reality is that while these things can work, and probably do work if they have somewhat of a reputation, the reason is not because of them, but rather because of the underlying principles that work 10 out of 10 times. See, there's actually one type of language learner that has a 100% success rate, and that learner is you. If you're watching this video, you've clearly already learned English to fluency, and if you're a non-native English speaker like myself, then you've probably learned multiple languages to fluency. Yet if you look at the way we go about language learning as adults, it would seem like we've all forgot about this one core principle that got us to fluency in the first place. Now, basically everyone knows that the way the school teaches us languages is really not the most effective way. But in spite of that, adults trying to learn a foreign language go down pretty much the exact same path, just a more fun version of it. So instead of a boring textbook and a teacher trying to explain it to you, it's now hand-picked resources. So you pick your own flashy app and you pick your own teachers. But you have to ask yourself this: if learning grammar and random vocabulary didn't work for you in school, then why would it work for you outside of school in the form of hand-picked resources instead? Now, it's understandable that this is the route most people go down, since the fact of learning languages like children do seems pretty ridiculous to most people. After all, we aren't toddlers lying in a crib forced to listen to our parents speak to us anymore. I'm sure you're a pretty smart person, so why not just use some of those brains and think yourself to learning a language instead? Surely that will work better, right? Well, the only problem with this approach is that no one has ever thought themselves to fluency in a language. A language isn't math where you have to explicitly think yourself to a solution. It's more a process of familiarizing yourself with sounds and a new way of expressing ideas, and then letting your brain subconsciously decode the language and figure out a way to use it properly. So what I'm going to be suggesting in this video is a way of learning languages that I think with pretty high levels of certainty has a 100% success rate for anyone who decides to follow through with it. And unlike traditional language learning study, it's actually going to make you fluent. Alright, so tell me then, what is the seemingly perfect language learning method that guarantees fluency to anyone who tries? Well, this is when I introduce you to linguist Stephen Krashen and his theory of second language acquisition. But don't worry, I won't bore you with all the linguistic, scientific details. I'll more so be using his ideas as a foundation for what we'll talk about today. So Krashen's main idea was that all humans acquire language in the exact same way, which is when we understand messages in the language. And this is a process very similar to the one we went through as children when we learned our first languages. You, for example, probably learned what the words eat and food were from your parents telling them to you every single time before you had a meal. And so the reason you understand those words so well is because you have a lot of context behind it. You don't just know the words, but you actually know the whole situation that they're associated with as well. And that's really the main point of this video. We don't learn languages, we acquire them. The reason you can speak your native language so well is because your brain has subconsciously worked on understanding it over many hours, to the point where you can understand it without thinking at all. Now, of course, not everything you learn has to be learned implicitly, and so intentionally studying languages can actually be a useful thing, which I'll go over a bit later. But the main takeaway here is that you'll never get to the point of subconscious understanding sufficient enough to be able to comfortably understand the language and express ideas fluently without actually doing the activity that got people speaking the language fluently fluent in the first place. Now, that's a mouthful, but I believe this is where the big issue lies. People try thinking their way to a result only obtained by people not thinking about obtaining it. Alright, so with all this linguistic, scientific stuff out of the way, how do we actually learn, or rather acquire, a language then? And this is where we get into more of the practical side of things and how to actually apply Krashen's main idea of comprehensible input. Alright, so the input hypothesis was probably Krashen's main idea, and it's all about naturally consuming the language with an intent of understanding messages in it. So your goal should be to understand what was said in the language, rather than obsessing about how it was said or why it was said. And the way you do this is by comprehensible input. Now, this is language either simple enough by nature or made simple enough by you so that you can understand it. Alright, you convinced me. This stuff works, and it's already taught us multiple languages to fluency. But how do I actually use it then? Well, that's what we're gonna get into right now. So in my mind, the most practical way for most people to use comprehensible input is via visual media. So for example, YouTube videos, TV shows, or movies. Now, this is because you can pretty much find content about any topic you like, with visuals accompanying the audio, at pretty much any difficulty level. Now, reading is also a very good form of comprehensible input. But the only issue with that is that you don't have the visuals to aid in your comprehension. And the fact that most people simply prefer to watch content rather than read it, especially in today's day and age. Now, you might be thinking that if you watch YouTube videos or movies in the language, then you wouldn't understand what's being said. And so you're thinking, how can I learn a language if I don't understand it? But this is where I got some good news for you. If you're learning any fairly common language, then you're probably in luck, because there are plenty of YouTube channels dedicated to providing language learners with more comprehensible material, using simpler vocabulary while speaking at a slower pace. This is perfect for beginner and intermediate learners, as it's still language naturally spoken to you by a native speaker, but it's not as overwhelming as putting on a TV show or a YouTube video made specifically for natives, which allows you to pick up language at a quicker pace, as well as make progress feel faster since you can understand more of it. Now, I personally went about learning both Spanish and Japanese this way, going from really simple videos for beginners at first, to a bit more advanced until I finally went on to native media. And an approach like this is what I'd recommend for most people learning. Making sure you're consistently getting input from native speakers from the start also ensures that when you do start speaking, your accent will be pretty good, and you'll also have a clue on how to hold a natural conversation. Now, what I want you to understand about using this approach, however, is that the input you're consuming should be above your level, but not massively above your level. So long as you're understanding some things that's being said, it means that you can improve using it. And if you understand a lot of things, but not all things, then it's probably around the sweet spot. A big problem people starting out with comprehensible input have is the fear of not understanding things, which makes them cling on to English subtitles and only watch content that they can completely understand. And this is a massive problem, since you need to be actively challenging yourself in order to acquire new language. And so the reality is that you're probably never gonna feel 100% ready to watch native content, and that's perfectly understandable. After all, it's probably been a very long time since someone spoke to you and you couldn't understand what they were saying. It almost makes you feel like you're a kid again. But at some point, you'll simply have to take a leap and jump into it. Now, don't get me wrong, I definitely hate the feeling of not understanding things myself, especially if it's a really good show or something like that I'm watching. But waiting until you're perfect in a language before actually doing the thing that gets people perfect in the first place is the exact thing that will ensure you never reach said perfection. And besides that, perfection probably doesn't exist anyways. So long as you can try to reframe the activity into something that's enjoyable, then who cares how much you can understand? So long as that understanding is gradually improving, right? Remember, the goal here is not to understand 100% of what's being said. If you're doing that, well, then you don't need to worry about it anymore, right? The goal is rather to understand the general gist of what's being said, and understand some messages in the language. This is the only way that your brain actually acquires language. And with time, when you understand more and more, your brain is going to get accustomed to the language, and you're going to be able to understand it and speak it naturally. Now, a very important thing to understand here as well is that while you can't probably understand everything that's being said, you can most likely still understand some words, and some words turn into sentences, especially with the visuals helping you out as well. So even if you're not understanding a whole lot, you can probably still pick up vocabulary pretty consistently from this. Now, on the topic of vocabulary, I previously mentioned that intentionally studying a language can be beneficial for language acquisition as well. So we'll get into what I think the value of explicit learning for language acquisition is now. Alright, so from what I've discussed so far, it would seem like I'm basically just telling you to learn a language the way that kids are learning it. And after all, we aren't kids anymore, so why should we learn languages in the same way that they do? And yeah, that's a fair point, and probably somewhat true, in the sense that you can, and most likely should, utilize some amount of conscious learning in your journey to fluency. That's really not something I'm trying to dissuade you from. My main point here isn't telling you that any kind of memorization or explicit learning is pointless, but rather that you shouldn't go down the route of most people and completely forgetting about the main principle that got you fluent in your native language in the first place. And so this is when we get into Krashen's acquisition learning hypothesis, which discusses the difference between deductive and inductive learning. So let me break it down for you. How you go about learning in a classroom setting is deductive. Someone explains a rule that you then follow and try to improve your understanding of the language from. That could, for example, be that adding ly to the end of an adjective often makes it an adverb. Quick plus ly makes quickly. You now know how to modify an adjective into an adverb. But you can probably hear from that explanation alone that it's not a very natural way of acquiring language. And so there's no wonder how people later down the line struggle to produce natural speech and understand natural speech when that's the only type of studying they've ever done. And I'm a testament of that myself. Now, for some reason, I thought learning and memorizing more grammar rules was going to help me to understand the language in a more natural way. But boy, was I wrong. The reality is that you can't memorize and think yourself to what's supposed to be a natural, subconscious process. And so this is where the inductive approach comes in. An example of this would be hearing an s added to nouns when describing multiple of them, and that this is then a very common way of forming plurals. Now, with this being said, the best way to utilize conscious study in my mind for language acquisition would be doing something like learning the most common words and some very common useful grammar rules to aid in your comprehension. From the earlier examples, I think we can both agree on the fact that explicitly trying to remember and learn the reasons for why everything works the way it works is extremely impractical. But at the same time, learning some common grammar rules and words can actually be very useful and be a way of understanding more things when you're consuming the language naturally. After all, I did say comprehensible input can be comprehensible by nature or made more comprehensible by the learner. And so that is something that I think explicit learning can help with. So with that being said, I believe that conscious study should only be ancillary to your main practice of comprehensible input. Which means that instead of seeing it as a way of directly learning the language, it should rather be used supplementary to your main learning practice and be seen as a way to increase the comprehension from your input. That means that learning a word without context shouldn't really be seen as learning it, but rather as putting a little entry into your mental dictionary that'll help you recognize the word next time you hear it in a piece of media. Now, I made the mistake of pretty much only utilizing conscious study when I started learning Spanish, and that really backfired for me, because even though I could understand plenty and also form my own sentences, I was always stuck in my head trying to translate between English and Spanish, because that's the only way that I've learned previously. If the only way I learned words was to translate it from English into Spanish, then of course I'm gonna have to translate every time I hear a Spanish speaker say it to me. Now, this of course makes keeping up with conversation or speaking yourself extremely difficult and impractical. And the only way that I've been able to come up with a way to fix this is to simply spend more time consuming the language in its natural state. So while it's hard at first, it will get better. And the only way it's going to get better is if you keep pushing through those hard times when you can't understand anything. And so it's very important here that you don't get stuck in the very common trap of spending more time researching the language and how and why things are used the way they are, rather than naturally consuming it. Which brings us on to what I think is one of the biggest problems people learning languages have that you need to avoid for maximum results. A big concern people seem to have with the input hypothesis is the lack of emphasis on how things work. Krashen told people to focus on understanding what was being said, but not how or why it was being said. And that idea seems very foreign to a lot of people. I mean, in general, understanding why things are the way they are is a pretty crucial part of understanding a topic. So it's no wonder why people want to know why and how things work in a language. But it's just not very important when it comes to language learning, and it can actually be detrimental to your learning. I mean, could you imagine yourself making whole Reddit posts about why a basketball player is holding their hand like this instead of like this, or why a runner has their arms like this instead of like this? These small, minute details don't really matter at all. And the reality is that even if you got a good answer from someone, you probably wouldn't be able to implement exactly what they did anyways, and it wouldn't help you because you'd have to learn it through experience. Now, of course, knowing the why of things can be beneficial, but the extent to which some people obsess over these things when it comes to learning languages is pretty wild to me. I mean, there are so many synonyms and absurd grammar rules that we use with total accuracy in our day-to-day lives without having ever obsessed over how and why they were used the way they were. But the reality is that you probably don't need to ask anyone what the perfect adjective of describing something is. Because if it's a question important enough to be worth asking, then you'll find out about it anyways. And if it's not, well, then you just save yourself some time and some mental energy. Now, the good thing about learning vocabulary through consuming the language naturally is that unlike learning words in isolation, you'll now have full context, since you have a native speaker using the word in a situation right in front of you. This gets rid of any potential confusion about using what words in what sentences, which is a big problem many language learners have. But if you, for example, hear the word quick being used in a certain situation and fast being used in another one, Even if they have similar meanings, you'll pretty quickly get a grasp of when and how to use each one without ever having to ask. And this is why also in my mind, most of your quote-unquote study time should be interacting with the language in its natural state. Because this, unlike conscious, explicit study, actually teaches you how the language is used in a natural setting. Now, despite all of this, some people will still be skeptical. And that's understandable because of how used we are to the traditional way of learning languages. I mean, the idea of learning perfect grammar, something we couldn't do in school even when we had a teacher explaining it to us, this time from someone just speaking the language, seems pretty absurd. But for that, I'd like to give you a little thought experiment, which is to tell me which one of the following sentences is the grammatically correct one. Now you can pause to think if you want to, but honestly I doubt you'll even need it. Option 1 is the big red dog, and option 2 is the red big dog. Now if your English is good enough to understand this video, then that example should have been very easy to you. But why? Did you conclude that the first sentence is the correct one because you know that in English, size comes before color? Or did you just conclude it because it sounded good? Now I bet practically all of you knew which one the correct sentence was from it just sounding better. And you haven't ever obsessed over why which one was correct. Yet it's obvious to basically all of you. Now this is because we can intuitively sense whether something sounds good or not. And that's exactly what you learn from comprehensible input. So even though I do recommend a bit of conscious grammar study in the beginning to give yourself a head start in your comprehension, I really don't think you need to worry much about it past the beginning stages, as it's usually something that will just take care of itself. After all, that's how most things work in life. I mean, I don't know the technical differences between an airplane and a car, yet I know that one goes faster, and therefore I know which one to take when I'm traveling 10 miles versus 10,000 miles. So alright, fine, you've convinced me, this all makes sense, you're a genius. But how about speaking? How can I speak a language when I've never practiced speaking before? And that's a fair concern, so let's address that. Now, speaking is of course an integral part of language learning. After all, you don't ask someone if they can understand the language, you ask them if they can speak it, right? But what you have to ask yourself here is how you'll be able to speak a language that you can't yet understand. Does it really seem that beneficial to try and have conversations, stuttering your way to creating a sentence, not to even be able to understand what the person is going to respond to you back with? The reality regarding speaking is that you have to actually be able to understand the language first. Otherwise, it's like trying to build a house when all you have is a handful of bricks. It's just not going to work all that well. Sure, you won't be an expert at building the house if all you've done is gather some raw materials. But without those materials, there's not even a house to speak of in the first place. So in the beginning of learning a language, what I recommend you to do is to focus basically all on input. And then when you get to a position where you can comfortably understand at least pretty basic conversations, then you can start outputting a little bit as well. Exactly when this is for you will depend on the person. You might be very extroverted, know a bunch of people who speak the language, and not really want to achieve the highest level of fluency. In that case, you can start speaking earlier. And if you're the other type of person, well then wait on speaking. For the best possible results in terms of accent and overall speaking, I'd probably recommend on holding off on it pretty much as long as you possibly can. The reason for this is because once you can actually comprehend the language and understand pretty much all of what's being said, then you really won't have any issues of outputting when it's time for that. It might take you a little bit of time to get used to just speaking the language and forming certain words, but it shouldn't take that long once you can actually understand everything that's being said to you. And like I said before, if you focus too much on outputting, it won't really be productive at all, because not only will you struggle to actually speak, but you'll also be wasting time that you could have potentially spent on inputting instead and getting more language into your head. So take your time with starting to speak and consider what your goals actually are. So now for a little recap. Language learning and acquisition are two different things. One coming from inductive, implicit practices, and the other one from deductive, explicit ones. And if you want to reach a comfortable level in a foreign language, then your approach has to be the more natural one. Humans all acquire language in the same way, no matter their age, and that's by understanding messages in the language, aka from comprehensible input. And the best kind of input is that which is both interesting and a bit challenging, such as a YouTube video slightly above your current level. By watching and then understanding the messages being conveyed in this input, your brain will subconsciously learn how the language works, without you ever having to know how or why things are the way they are. But explicit learning of, for example, common words can be beneficial in order to increase this comprehension. Consuming sufficient comprehensible input with increasing difficulty has already taught you one or more languages to fluency. So there's a 100% chance that you'll reach your goal of fluency in whatever language it is you're learning from that same method as well. And don't worry about speaking before you understand the language, as that's a skill you pick up pretty quickly once your comprehension is high enough. With all that being said, I think anyone who's interested in achieving some resemblance of fluency in a foreign language has to ask themselves how people who actually achieved that got there in the first place. So hopefully the points brought up in this video has given you a better understanding of how fluency is actually acquired, because I sure know they helped with my learning. That's all I got for you today. See you in the next video.